Tycoons are in many ways the lifeblood of society.
They're the most competitive people you will ever find.
Inside the secret world of the mega-rich are some of the most powerful people on the planet. This time, Russia. Its ultra-rich tycoons, called oligarchs, used to be able to flaunt their wealth across the globe.
Truffles, caviar, champagne, that's the culture of being a Russian oligarch.
But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything.
We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets.
As the oligarchs face their greatest challenge, we look back on how they amassed their billions.
It was really just a crazy, unfair situation where 22 guys owned all the assets, everyone else was living in destitute poverty.
And why the world is asking, could President Putin actually be one of the richest men on the planet?
Russia is much more incredible than fiction. In Putin's Russia, that's certainly for sure.
In October 2003, 12 years after Russia embraced capitalism, the richest man in the country was arrested and put in a cage. He was placed there by this man, the president of Russia.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
"30 years ago, out of the ashes of communism, a new capitalist economy was born. For a brief part of history, it offered hope of a better life for all. But the new free market descended into chaos, with widespread food shortages and increased crime. For a few, it was an opportunity to gain enormous wealth.
We saw a new super-rich class emerge with incredible speed.
They live extravagant lifestyles with mega yachts, supercars, and mansions. But their lives are always under the crosshairs of their leader, a ruthless ex-KGB agent who asserts his power.
Putin has to be the richest of the rich. He has to be the oligarch, the billionaire, to beat all the other oligarchs and billionaires.
Since the invasion of Ukraine, he has demanded their loyalty.
But any people, even more so the Russian people, will always be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors.
Now the oligarchs face a grave crisis, caught between sanctions in the West and a backlash at home. And no one encapsulates their story better than a former street trader. Roman Abramovich is best known for buying Chelsea Football Club in 2003. He made his money through Sibneft, a Russian oil major, and he owns stakes in steel giant Evraz, Norilsk Nickel, and the country's largest aluminum company, Rusal. But he had humble beginnings.
Roman Abramovich was an orphan. He grew up in very poor circumstances.
Abramovich developed some highly successful trading skills, starting out selling rubber ducks.
And he clearly had an entrepreneurial gift.
But the young businessman really gathered some wealth by trading oil.
Through his oil trading activities, he eventually acquired some very powerful political connections.
In the early 90s, President Yeltsin was selling off the vast state assets to raise much-needed cash for the flailing economy. Abramovich made his way to Yeltsin's inner circle behind a colorful and highly influential character, Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky noticed Yeltsin often struck deals between sets on the tennis courts.
Immediately, the people with the best connections to the existing Russian government under Boris Yeltsin, they were the people who immediately benefited.
In 1995, Abramovich acquired a stake in the state oil company named Sibneft. The stock went on to explode in value after the deal was done. Abramovich was reported to have been firmly in favor of Yeltsin. He even lived in an apartment in the Kremlin compound. This catapulted him into the billionaire class, and he became an influential figure.
Abramovich is someone who really very carefully thinks about every investment, every deal that he does. He's not impulsive or instinctive.
In 2000, the oligarchs supported Putin to power.
Some of these oligarchic figures thought for themselves that he is a forward-thinking, perhaps even progressive, moderate politician. He is someone who perhaps they can help steer, just as they've done with President Yeltsin.
But they were in for a nasty shock.
It's very clear by the first and second years of Putin's term in power that the oligarchs have supported someone for president that they underestimated. President Putin himself is going to be the actual man and regime in charge.
Putin launched a crackdown on the oligarchs.
And so he outmaneuvers all of the old-style oligarchs, people like Boris Berezovsky and others who've been close to Yeltsin, who thinks that they can manipulate Putin, and they find out very quickly that they actually cannot.
Berezovsky and Putin had a huge falling out, and Berezovsky left the country in 2000. In 2005, Abramovich sold his stake in Sibneft to the Russian government for over $13 billion. Berezovsky tried to sue Abramovich for breach of contract in the biggest civil case in UK history. He claimed that he and Abramovich were part owners of Sibneft.
Roman Abramovich, the Russian billionaire, has been defending himself at the High Court in London against accusations that he betrayed a business rival. The allegation is made by Boris Berezovsky, who claims that he was bullied, in effect, into selling oil shares at a fraction of their worth.
In statements submitted to the court, he said, "I was not his protege. He was not my mentor. I was quite surprised by his extravagant lifestyle. However, I was never interested in imitating this lifestyle."
The judge ruled in favor of Abramovich, saying that Berezovsky had never been an owner. Berezovsky was left close to bankruptcy.
Sometimes I had the impression that Putin himself wrote this judgment. Sometimes I had this impression.
Less than a year later, Berezovsky was found dead at his country home with a ligature around his neck. The coroner returned an open verdict. Abramovich, meanwhile, was free to splash his cash on some very extravagant toys. One of his yachts, the Eclipse, is worth $500 million. It's rumored it costs around $1 million just to fill it up with fuel. It has 2 helicopter pads, 2 swimming pools, several hot tubs, a mini submarine, and a missile detection system. After Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Abramovich's future is uncertain. The UK froze some of his assets, including his beloved Chelsea Football Club, which was later sold. Whether Abramovich will be able to hold on to his billions remains to be seen. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution brought about the Soviet Union and the first communist country. It lasted for most of the 20th century. Following Marxist economic theories, Soviet leaders from Lenin onwards banned private ownership.
So Russia started out as a country where all the wealth was held by the state.
В этот день звучат слова благодарности коммунистической партии и советскому правительству за новое проявление заботы о наших детях.
Doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
The Cold War began to thaw in 1985, when Yeltsin's predecessor, Gorbachev, befriended U.S. President Ronald Reagan. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, as the world looked on with hope.
Troops took control of the key section of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate early this morning. They stopped the party, but any hopes they had of stopping the West Berliners destroying the wall were soon dashed. As dozens of young men pulled on a rope and chains, the chant went up, Mauer weg, down with the wall.
The Soviet Union was fast-forwarded into the modern era. This first taste of capitalism ignited an entrepreneurial spirit.
They filled up their cars, went to China, came back and sold things 10 times, 100 times the price.
Russians started wanting a wealthier lifestyle. Then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed.
It begins in the Baltic states, soon extends into Eastern European republics themselves in places like Ukraine, places like Moldova. Every one of the republics has declared independence. There is no more Soviet Union.
But the fall of the Soviet Union brought new problems. Gorbachev fell out of favor, and Boris Yeltsin became the new leader of an independent Russia. He inherited a country in dire straits.
It was broke. There was very little food in the stores. The banks were on the brink of collapse. The economy was on its knees. And so President Yeltsin and the regime, they desperately needed money.
He turned to the West for help.
American advisors said, well, what you need is to sell everything off, privatize everything, move to a free market economy, and that's the way forward.
Yeltsin issued vouchers to the entire Russian population.
They gave a voucher to every person, so there's 150 million vouchers in circulation.
The vouchers were to be used to purchase shares in state-owned companies. Only a few knew their true value.
Many people wouldn't know what to do with these vouchers. They had to sell them off because they were so poor, and clever people bought a lot of these vouchers and through that could then take over state properties.
However, the vouchers didn't solve the need to pay the wages and pensions. Yeltsin needed cash and quick, and one man had a solution. Vladimir Putin was the richest man in Russia in March 2022. He set up Interos Bank and made his fortune by acquiring Norilsk Nickel, a company close to bankruptcy under communism that quickly found enormous commercial value. He is known as the brains behind the scheme called loans for shares. The financial plan was the birth of the oligarchy.
He was really the architect, the mastermind behind Russia's privatization program. In the 90s, he was really known as the uber oligarch of all.
The way the scheme worked was the well-connected lent the Kremlin money, and if the government defaulted on the loan, they received shares in the country's national industries. By his own admission, he and other oligarchs reaped the rewards.
Because of the absence of strict regulation, this helped us to become rich and powerful, let's say, faster than we could if we worked in, let's say, normal conditions.
And his commercial awareness paid off with a political role.
His great financial clout and influence even bought him a place in the Yeltsin government.
In 1996, Putin became deputy prime minister. But while a few prospered, many ordinary Russians did not.
The vast number of Russian people were completely ripped off, and the new free market economy didn't work in the sense it didn't deliver for the Russian people.
There's literal starvation in provinces in Russia. Professors had to become taxi drivers, nurses had to become prostitutes. And so there wasn't a person in Russia that was happy at the end of the Yeltsin era.
Potanin says Russia needed a quick solution before the country slipped back into communism. But he acknowledges it wasn't faultless.
The method was not, let's say, 100% fair. The rules were not clear. But please believe that it was difficult to make it quickly, and the opposition was very strong.
Yeltsin was popular among the people, but after a series of uncomfortable televised appearances, faith in his leadership waned. By 1999, it was the end of the road for Yeltsin. Alcoholism took its toll, and his health deteriorated. The following year, Vladimir Putin became president of Russia. A new era for the oligarchs began. Born in St. Petersburg in 1952, Putin joined the Russian security services, the KGB, at age 23, and soon worked his way up the ranks.
He'd obviously been trained from the very beginnings of joining the KGB as a young man back in the 1970s in what was then Leningrad, to conceal information about himself.
He was selected as a potential successor to Yeltsin and took up a place in the administration in 1996. He became a popular choice for leadership. The public believed him to be a strong leader, a religious man, and somebody that would crush corruption.
This bare-chested bear of a man who is willing to do what these effeminate Western leaders are not willing to do.
The oligarchs supported his rise, expecting him to be progressive like Yeltsin. But Putin had no intention of allowing the oligarchs control over his presidency.
Yeltsin fell prey to the machinations of the various oligarchs around him. Putin does not want to be in that position. Putin has to be the richest of the rich. He has to be the oligarch, the billionaire, to beat all the other oligarchs and billionaires.
He rallied popularity among the public, presenting himself as a charismatic action man, riding with bikers, flying microlights, spearfishing, cuddling animals and children. He won the public's affections. But his most popular move was reasserting control. His currency? Fear.
Вот это государство вы сами и формировали в значительной степени через подконтрольные вам политические и околополитические структуры. Поэтому меньше всего, наверное, нужно кивать на зеркало.
He began with a bang by pursuing the most famous oligarch in all of Russia. In 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the wealthiest man in Russia. He made his fortune from oil. Khodorkovsky had a background in chemistry and a gift for pioneering new businesses.
He's a very smart guy from a technical institution. He's very much an independent thinker, but he was too far ahead of his time.
In 1988, he established one of the country's first private banks. He loaned the government money and struck gold when the government defaulted on the loan, and he acquired a 78% stake in the state oil company, Yukos.
Yukos Oil Company, it became incredibly profitable and lucrative. And it was making billions of dollars.
And then he does something that is quite surprising for many of these Russian oligarchs. He actually, over time, wants to transform it into a Western-style company. and actually to run it as a for-profit concern, not as a cash cow that might be still linked into people close to the Kremlin.
He then used some of his income to fund opposition parties. This was a no-go for the Kremlin.
He was seen as a potential rival to Putin. So Putin was persuaded that he should be taken down.
The opportunity came when Khodorkovsky openly challenged Putin about state corruption on television. The footage would mark a historical turning point.
Масштабы коррупции в России в районе 30 миллиардов оценивается долларов. Это 10-12% ВВП.
Putin appeared to issue a quiet but devastating counterattack, accusing him of tax evasion.
А некоторые другие нефтяные компании, как, например, компания ЮКОС, имеют сверхзапасы. Как она их получила, это вот вопрос вполне обсуждаемый сегодня нами темы. В том числе и, значит, такие вопросы, как уплата или неуплата налогов. Мы с вами обсуждали в свое время.
Then, on October 25, 2003, Khodorkovsky's life was turned upside down.
Khodorkovsky was on his private jet. He landed on the runway, and his jet was surrounded by members of the Federal Security Service. They arrested Khodorkovsky. In Russia, when you are put on trial, there's a 99.7% conviction rate in criminal court in Russia. And then Putin allows the television cameras to come in the room to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And this had a profound effect on all the other oligarchs. Imagine that you're on your yacht, you're parked off in Antibes, France, flick on CNN, and there you see a guy far smarter, far more powerful, far richer than you, sitting in a cage. What's the natural reaction? You don't want to sit in that cage for yourself.
Khodorkovsky was found guilty of fraud and sent to jail. He claimed it was a political persecution.
So Khodorkovsky sits in a essentially gulag for a good decade to warn other oligarchs of the limits of their ownership and the limits of their commercial independence.
Khodorkovsky was eventually released in 2013. He was flown to Berlin and then moved to London. Today, he is one of Putin's fiercest critics.
You have to understand, we're dealing with a criminal group in power and not a state of law. This group, its power rests on force.
Bill Browder knows what it's like to be on the wrong side of Vladimir Putin. He was one of the early foreign investors in Russia's new stock market. In 2005, he was deported and his assets seized. He testified about the impact of Khodorkovsky's trial in front of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee.
Other oligarchs went to Vladimir Putin and said, what do we have to do to not sit in the cage? And he said, it's very straightforward, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And so he became the richest man in the world in that moment.
No one is sure if Putin is the richest man in the world, but Browder is convinced about the role of the oligarchs.
Oligarch network is feeding him massive amounts of money and doing his political bidding.
And they hold his money for him.
Got it.
And so if you want to get Vladimir Putin, sanction the top oligarchs as well.
In response, other oligarchs from the time have strenuously denied Browder's claims, while investigative journalists have tried to get to the bottom of Putin's purse strings.
But the person who's been most effective at this has been Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition figure. And that's why he's in jail, and that's why there was an attempt to assassinate him using Novichok, the same substance, but in a different form, that was used to poison Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury.
Novichok is a deadly nerve agent, a chemical weapon.
This was a very serious effort to eliminate Alexei Navalny because he's been exquisitely capable of unraveling and spooling an awful lot of the threads behind the corruption, the kleptocracy that surrounds Putin.
Navalny survived, but on return to Russia was jailed for breaking bail conditions while receiving life-saving treatment.
He returns to Moscow knowing full well he's going to be arrested. He releases a video that he spent an awful lot of time producing about the ownership threads that he and his team have traced to an enormous, luxurious, sumptuous villa on the Russian Black Sea, which is not just a palace, it puts Versailles to shame.
Navalny's team bypassed a no-fly zone with a drone to capture what is nicknamed Putin's Palace in all its glory. The property is reported to be worth over $1 billion and is full of extravagant opulence.
It isn't a country house or a residence, it's an entire city, or rather a kingdom. Among its many features, this green mound is reported to house an underground ice hockey rink.
He was almost mocking Putin for his lack of taste. There was this horrible pole dancing room and an aqua disco, and just really in poor taste.
Putin denied any ties to the palace, and a Russian billionaire later claimed ownership. And in March 2022, as the bombs rained down on Ukraine, Navalny was given a further 9 years in jail. It's unclear whether this was linked to Navalny's claims that this super yacht also belongs to Putin. Press reports valued the Scheherazade at around $700 million, making it one of the most expensive super yachts in the world. The British captain denied the super yacht belonged to Putin. It was, however, seized by Italian authorities. As for Putin's other critics, Bill Browder and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, they both fled to London. The city has become a favorite destination, too, for oligarchs. Alexander Lebedev made his money buying the Russian National Reserve Bank and acquired investments in Gazprom and Aeroflot.
Alexander Lebedev is a former KGB officer. He was stationed in London in the late Soviet era in the Soviet embassy. He's since been able to establish a great deal of clout within London's establishment itself.
Alexander Lebedev's road to riches began when he was stationed at the Soviet embassy in London from 1988 to 1992.
His job as a KGB officer was to really gather economic intelligence, commercial intelligence in terms of the British economy. He was a very smart guy, understood economics, and he realized that there were opportunities to become very wealthy.
By 2008, he was a multi-billionaire. But then in a confrontational television debate show on the financial crisis, he threw a punch at a property tycoon after claiming he'd been threatened. He was charged with hooliganism.
I was under investigation by 8 investigators for something I did in public, under 14 cameras with 300 witnesses. And I was expecting my sentence, risking 5 years in prison. I got 130 hours of community service, but I really became much quieter for a few years. Maybe perhaps I've lost most of my business.
He became a publisher rather than a luxury-loving billionaire and seemed relieved to lose that badge.
I came off the Forbes list and I'm so happy. I never bought anything in the south of France. Boats, I don't like it.
Then in 2009, he bought the loss-making London paper, the Evening Standard, for £1 British.
Alexander Lebedev saw the acquisition of the Evening Standard and later the Independent as a way of enhancing his influence in the UK. It wasn't a commercial, profit-making enterprise.
Lebedev disputes such claims. He and his son Yevgeny have raised considerable sums for charity, including a foundation promoting a free press. He organizes charity events and lavish parties, inviting the rich and famous. Yevgeny became close friends with Boris Johnson, and they famously spent a night on the streets of London. The much publicized footage showed the two playing to the cameras, but the rapport between them was clear.
This may look like a bit of a stunt, and in a way it is. Of course it is a bit of a stunt. You know, we are just getting a tiny idea of what it's like to sleep out. I trod in a big puddle over there, so I got slightly wet right foot.
I saved your life.
Russian oligarchs understood the importance of having good relations with politicians here.
The Evening Standard supported Boris Johnson during his time as London mayor.
Boris Johnson invited out to the Italian villa owned by Evgeny Lebedev and went there on quite a few occasions for parties, and then, you know, became closer and closer, and eventually Evgeny Lebedev was awarded a peerage.
Today, the former KGB officer's son sits in the House of Lords. He was given his peerage for his services to charity. The appointment caused a stir in the UK Parliament.
On the 17th of March 2020, when British intelligence reportedly warned against the granting a peerage to the Prime Minister's close friend and now Lord Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia. So can he tell the House what changed between the security warning and the appointment?
Boris Johnson denied intervening over Lord Lebedev's peerage. And Lebedev himself denies he poses any threat to national security. The Lebedevs are not the only Russian tycoons who have made London their new home. The arrival of Russian oligarchs in London has supercharged the economy.
Russians like to spend big. When the Russian oligarchs moved to London, one of the priority was to buy property. As a bolt hole, their favorite areas would be Knightsbridge, particularly if it was close to Harrods, if they have properties within the heart of the British establishment, which is Mayfair, Belgravia, Kensington, Chelsea, and those areas, they feel accepted.
There's been a number of unexplained deaths of Russians in Britain. Alexander Litvinenko was an ex-KGB agent who became a British citizen in 2006.
He was a former member of the security services who essentially had defected to the West.
In 1998, he accused Putin's KGB of plotting to assassinate Boris Berezovsky and killing a journalist, just 2 weeks before he himself mysteriously fell ill. On November 1st, 2006, Litvinenko drank deadly tea in the Millennium Hotel in London's Mayfair. He was known as the man who solved his own audacious murder when he guessed that he'd been poisoned. It became a diplomatic incident.
Putin wanted to make an example out of him, but he also wanted to test the British system of justice. And he discovered that there really is not a very robust system of justice.
Putin has always denied the Russian state is involved in any sponsored assassinations. Some oligarchs have also tried to make inroads into the American political system. Oleg Deripaska made his fortune in metals. He had a modest upbringing, largely raised by his grandparents.
My grandmother, she was always, careful with the light. There was no light in the house.
He started trading in metals at a time when the Soviet Union had collapsed and lawlessness reigned. Aluminum promised massive profits, and blood was spilled. Gangsters and businessmen vied to control the industry. Around 100 people were murdered. Although there is no suggestion that Deripaska was involved in any criminality, he did end up in control after the feuding subsided.
Deripaska was able to emerge on top from a period which in the 90s had been really vicious. The era was known as the Aluminium Wars.
He has claimed in the past that he restored order to the industry.
It was like a Wild West in Russia.
It's not a period he remembers with pride.
To go through without any single thing which you could later believe in was wrong. It was very difficult. But I believe whatever I did, I can't say that I'm proud, but I believe, that I did the right thing.
Deripaska married into the Yeltsin circle and quickly adjusted to life under Putin.
The Kremlin had taken control of law enforcement. Most businessmen only owned their businesses through the Kremlin's grace.
Deripaska managed to maintain a working relationship with Putin.
The oligarchs are now going to be subservient to the state itself. And this is a shift, this is a new dynamic.
Putin showed who was the boss on national TV after Deripaska shut down a metals plant, leaving workers without wages.
Считаю, что вы сделали заложниками своих амбиций, непрофессионализма, а может быть просто и тривиальной жадности.
Deripaska was called up like a naughty schoolboy to sign an agreement to reopen his plant. Part of his plan was expanding in the USA. And in 2003, he hired former Senator Bob Dole to lobby on his behalf.
He's able to go to one of the leaders of the American Republican Party and say, I would like to give you a slice of my newfound wealth in order to access your country, your policymaking apparatus. Dole agrees, Dole takes the money, and the doors of the United States of America are suddenly open to Mr. Deripaska.
Deripaska became known for throwing lavish parties at Davos, the World Economic Forum.
He is succeeding in creating this image of himself as a globe-trotting member of the global elite.
Deripaska built a presence across the globe. In 2006, he formed N+ Group, and Rusal became the world's largest aluminum producer. He really hit the headlines with the Mueller inquiry into Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election.
He was very close with Paul Manafort, who was the former head chief of staff in the Trump campaign.
The investigation into alleged links between Donald Trump's election campaign and Russia has taken a dramatic turn, with the news that his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, had been indicted by a federal grand jury.
Manafort was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 2019.
Traitor!
His convictions included tax fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and unregistered lobbying. A year later, he was pardoned by President Trump. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Rusal, N+, and seized some of Deripaska's assets in 2018. Oleg Deripaska denied all the charges leveled against him. He attempted to clear his name by suing the U.S. Treasury. Reporters asked him about the case.
And I know that I was punished only because I was a Russian businessman. There was no other Russian explanation. And I hope to see what they will present in court, when they need to present their answers.
The suit was unsuccessful. But the U.S. Treasury under Trump did lift the sanctions on Rusal and N+ after Deripaska reduced his majority ownership. Trump's relationship to Putin has been much discussed.
And so Putin was really more of an image for Trump of something that he wanted to be himself. He had degrees of autocrat envy. And he certainly saw Putin, on that surface as being the richest of the rich, potentially the richest man in the world, running a country as if it was his own asset. And so he also saw him as being not just fabulously rich, but fabulously powerful.
And as for Deripaska,
he has come a long, long way from being simply a rising businessman with close ties, allegedly, to organized crime.
And in 2021, Deripaska suffered further trouble in the U.S. when the FBI raided his homes in New York and Washington, D.C. And when Putin invaded Ukraine, the UK imposed further sanctions on Deripaska, freezing his assets there too.
What we've concluded is that there is enough connection, enough of a link between the Putin regime and the individuals in question to justify the action. I can see that people connected to the Putin regime need to be sanctioned, and that's what we're doing.
Thanks to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the oligarchs have seen multiple super yachts, private jets, and stately homes seized by Western Europe and the United States. The U.S. government announced in February 2022 a new klepto capture unit to enforce sanctions that have been imposed.
We will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to investigate, arrest, and prosecute those whose criminal acts enable the Russian government to continue this unjust war.
One of the most loyal of the new breed of oligarchs is from Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg. Yevgeny Prigozhin is alleged to have made his money from large catering contracts with the Kremlin.
Out of the most recent oligarchs, those who were closest to Putin, Mr. Prigozhin is probably the most interesting, perhaps the most obvious candidate for scrutiny.
Prigozhin is actually, by all accounts, a pretty talented guy. He is, by all accounts, an incredibly talented chef. In fact, he is known as Putin's chef.
He served jail time for robbery, fraud, and involving minors in crime. After his release, he became a hot dog vendor before segueing into the restaurant business. Putin became a regular patron of his restaurants, and Prigozhin became a confidant. He received large contracts to feed Russia's schools and military, as well as catering for state banquets. And in 2002, President George W. Bush was a guest, with Prigozhin always by Putin's side.
I had a rather unexpected encounter with Mr. Prigozhin that I was unaware of until I saw some footage. I'm sitting next to Putin at one of these expert dinners, and Mr. Prigozhin is the person who's serving us with the food. And I hadn't realized that the whole time that I'd been at this dinner, which was all heavily staged and orchestrated, Mr. Prigozhin was part of all of that staging and orchestration and was in charge of all of the catering.
Quite whether Prigozhin's role was purely food-related is a little murky. History would later see him accused of cooking up some very different recipes for the Kremlin.
He begins moving into a new space entirely, the social media space.
Prigozhin was accused of attempting to sway the 2016 U.S. general election by creating something called the Internet Research Agency.
He was someone who could foresee the impact and influence of social media in and of itself.
In 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted 13 Russians connected to the agency.
The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States. 12 of the individual defendants worked at various times for a company called Internet Research Agency, LLC, a Russian company based in St. Petersburg. Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin funded the conspiracy.
U.S. intelligence described the agency as a troll farm, which it said employed fake accounts or bots on major social media networks.
These were Russian trolls sitting at keyboards in St. Petersburg, targeting American tensions to sow chaos across the board.
They used stolen or fictitious American identities, fraudulent bank accounts, and false identification documents. According to the indictment, the Americans did not know that they were communicating with Russians.
A lot of it was really amplifying the really hot-button topics and the divisions and cleavages that have emerged, for example, gun rights, abortion, religious identity.
Prigozhin denied interfering in the 2016 election, saying, if they want to see the devil, let them. In 2020, U.S. intelligence also announced that Prigozhin was believed to be behind a private army called Wagner.
He has been connected to all number of other extraterritorial Kremlin interests.
The Wagner Group has been heavily involved in operations overseas for Russia, where the Russians don't want to risk conventional military forces.
Military analysts say Wagner offers Russian military plausible deniability. Prigozhin was sanctioned by the EU and the UK for alleged links to Wagner activities. The EU accused Wagner of serious human rights abuses, including torture. In 2021, the FBI offered $250,000 for information leading to the arrest of Prigozhin.
He has been identified by the highest levels of the American government, one of the most successful players in Russian efforts at destabilizing Western countries, including the United States of America.
Prigozhin has always denied any connection with Wagner activities or any wrongdoing. In recent years, intelligence services have been closing in on Putin's finances, and so have journalists.
In early 2016, hundreds of journalists around the world published an unprecedented look into the world of the offshore economy.
This was known as the Panama Papers. At its heart was information leaked from a firm called Mossack Fonseca.
It was a law firm, an offshoring firm based in, as the name says, Panama, providing offshoring and anonymous wealth services to any client around the world.
In March 2018, Mossack Fonseca said it was shut down as a result of reputational damage due to the Panama Papers leak. It denied any wrongdoing. In 2020, prosecutors issued arrest warrants for its partners on charges of accessory to tax evasion and forming a criminal organization.
But there was one figure in particular that emerged in the Panama Papers that I think everybody kind of raised an eyebrow at. He wasn't an especially well-known figure, certainly for his politics or even for his wealth in and of itself. He was known, of all things, for his musical talents.
Sergei Raldugin is a professional musician and artistic director at the St. Petersburg House of Music. It is well known that he is a close personal friend of Vladimir Putin.
Raldugin is one of the figures emerging in the Panama Papers as secretly controlling a remarkable portfolio of wealth using some of these offshore anonymous financial vehicles.
The Panama Papers unveiled a $2 billion offshore scheme involving Raldugin. Some question whether there was more to this than meets the eye. Putin claimed the transactions were for buying expensive instruments. Raldugin denied wrongdoing, saying any wealth linked to him was donations from businessmen to buy musical instruments for young Russians.
Вот то, что Сергей Павлович купил, Ралдугин, он купил там, по-моему, 2 скрипки, 2 виолончели. Это уникальные вещи. Последнюю, которую он приобрел, ну, я скажу, потому что это было уже в интернете, около $12 миллионов.
Putin's finances have long been the subject of speculation, as has his relationship with some Russian oligarchs. But as billions are wiped off their collective worth as a result of Putin's bloody war, that bond faces its greatest test. Perhaps it was the oligarchs he was referring to in this angry address.
I do not at all judge those who have a villa in Miami or on the French Riviera, who can't do without foie gras, oysters, or the so-called gender freedoms. But the issue here is not in that, but in the fact that many of these people, by their very nature, are mentally located exactly there, and not here, not with our people, not with Russia.
So I think Putin does see himself as a czar in many respects. He sees himself as a historic figure, carrying on at least the legacy of the czars.
The oligarch's ability to straddle the fence, enjoying the best of both worlds, is over. In the words of a Russian proverb, there's no escape from fate.
There are never happy endings to Russian stories. So there's not going to be happy endings for most of the Russian oligarchs. It's a terrible dog-eat-dog world to get where they got, and it's kind of hard to see happy endings for most of these people.